Well, hello everyone, and keeping with our commitment that we don't punish the punctual, we're going to kick off hard on 6 o'clock tonight. Actually, it's a little bit past 6, but just to start by saying, as always, it's really lovely to see so many of you here tonight. So as always, thank you for giving me your time. If you can believe it, it's nearly 150 weeks now, or it's just over 1,017 days, which has included 30 sitting weeks since this 47th Parliament first began. And we are obviously rapidly coming to the end of it, which will not only see the seat of North Sydney abolished after 124 years of representation, but will actually see a really important chapter in my own personal life come to an end. As you would have heard me say, though, on several occasions now, it's never been about me. It's always been about our community. And I continue to be incredibly grateful that North Sydney trusted me when we decided to take our voice and our vote back. It's been an incredible privilege to be able to represent this community as we've sought to prove to people that actually politics is something that can be done differently. A political movement that focuses on building consensus as a way to move our nation forward, I think has been incredibly productive in the 47th Parliament. And while I won't be running, I am incredibly excited to see what the 48th Parliament brings with what I'm hoping will be an expanded crossbench. In true North Sydney form, we didn't waste a single minute during what was our most recent sitting fortnight. And so in what is likely to be one of the last of these sorts of debriefs from me to you, I just wanted to start by thanking my incredible team for all the work that they do. You know, in the 47th Parliament, the government has introduced no less than 325 pieces of new legislation across almost every conceivable area of public policy in this country, from climate and environmental law reform through to integrity reform, treasury laws, human rights matters, employment laws, education and immigration. There's not been a single area that I don't think my team has even flinched at stepping into. And in many instances, our capacity as a team was augmented by the contributions of ordinary people right across our electorate. So thank you for your incredible support. In total, over the course of that time, I've spoken over 250 times in Parliament, including asking questions of the government, proposing amendments to and debating the merits of particular pieces of legislation, delivering constituency statements, and calling out parliamentary behaviour. And every time I've stood in that place, I have channeled our community's courage. So thank you for your ongoing support. At the same time, the team back here in the electorate office have been incredibly busy helping people with their personal challenges, whether those were challenges with visas, passports, NDIS, or social services or accommodations issues, or even grants. You know, in fact, our constituent team has resolved over 18,390 matters for people in our community. So that's nearly 125 cases every week, which I think is quite extraordinary. As we come into what must be the final 10 weeks of this term, however, with the latest possible date for the election being the 16th of May, we wanted to give you a rundown on what we did focus on during the first two sitting weeks in 2025, with those sitting weeks having taken place from the 4th of February to the 13th of February. And look, it would come as no surprise to anyone on the call tonight that, as always, the time in Parliament was hectic, with days that frequently start incredibly early, with breakfasts that kick off at 7:30, and nights that don't finish until 8 o'clock. And in fact, given the legislative agenda we had to get through, there were a number of nights where they extended parliamentary sitting hours through until 10:30. So it makes it a real slog to get through those parliamentary sitting weeks. Also, as expected, the workload was dominated by working double time to not only stay across the legislation that was being moved, but also trying to make sure that we were catching up with the ministers and other members in the House of Parliament to prosecute the cases that we believe we needed to, either for our electorate or for our overall national agenda. As an aside note, we actually took the opportunity to ask the Parliamentary Library to run some numbers for us to help measure the work rate that we were pumping out. And we found that actually, as an independent team, we've been 3 times more active than the average backbencher in either of the major parties. So that means we've done 3 times the work. So I guess it's little wonder that all of us here in the electorate office feel a little bit like it's been a 9-year term rather than a 3-year term, but it's certainly been absolutely worth it. On the top line, it was a jammed pack fortnight full of speeches, briefings and interviews with several key issues, including the underhanded way that the two major parties colluded to force through the electoral reform legislation they pursued, the development of the hate crimes legislation and the late introduction of mandatory sentencing to that legislation, and the tabling of a report into anti-Semitism in universities, to which I tabled additional comments. All of these bills and legislative manoeuvres took up an exorbitant amount of time and energy. In addition to these matters, there was debate on tax incentives, the early childhood education and care 3-day guarantee, electricity infrastructure, and the Parliament's failure to deliver on ambitious climate reform, which meant that I think we more than carried our own weight in the last 2 weeks. My valedictory speech was an incredibly special moment. It happened on the first day of the second week, and it provided an important opportunity to set the record straight on what we've achieved as an independent seat during this Parliament. And it meant the world to me to see so many people down there. So thank you so much for having buckled in from beginning to end. Legislatively, I was involved in a lot of really robust discussions around several key pieces of legislation. So they included a new piece of law around hate crimes. And as I said, I think what was particularly interesting about that legislation is that it had bipartisan support all the way through until the dying hours of a night at 8:20 at night. All of a sudden, we saw the major parties collude to introduce mandatory sentencing into that legislation, which then caused concerns for some of us on the crossbench. To be clear, the reason I oppose mandatory sentencing as a principle is that it removes the right of our judicial system to decide how a person should be punished and forces our judicial system to abide by a set of laws created by government. I just don't think our government should have the right to be judge, jury and trial when it comes to criminal prosecutions in this country. So while overall I supported the new hate crimes legislation, I did vote against amending it to include mandatory sentencing. And I would do that again today. As a matter of principle, I've never supported mandatory sentencing in any of the legislation that this government sought to move during the 47th Parliament. And I'm disappointed that the Labor Party, who have had a long-term commitment to not supporting mandatory sentencing, actually backed down in the face of opposition pressure and put that into that bill. There was also a really important piece of legislation looking at scams and how Australians could be better protected. And in this case, I did argue for that legislation to be improved by making it clearer that the carriers of scams, so that may be telco companies, social media platforms or digital platforms, should actually bear part of the responsibility through financial compensation. I wasn't able to get amendments up to that effect, but I think the Treasurer was very aware of the concerns myself and others had on the crossbench and has undertaken, if re-elected, to look at it. I also was heavily involved around debate around a Treasury Laws Amendment Bill, which was about incentives and integrity. I spoke on the early childhood and education 3-day guarantee. I gave an MPI, matter of public importance speech on the Parliament as a whole, failing nature, because I think it's important the 47th Parliament accept responsibility. And we gave a constituent statement, a 90-second statement, putting on record how North Sydney had actually voted in this 47th Parliament, as the opposition is trying to weaponise some very dodgy numbers to try and suggest that independents like me are actually green Laborites in disguise. I was able to put a question on the vehicle emission standards directly to the Climate Change Minister, because we are seeing both the motor industry as well as the opposition combine forces to try and walk back our vehicle efficiency standards. And given that was something we fought so hard for as an electorate, I felt it was really important to get the government on record with their ongoing support for that. And then I also did an adjournment debate speech, which was perhaps one of the highlights of my entire electoral term, to be honest, because I was able to put on record what our incredible Net Zero North Sydney team has been able to achieve by working directly with councils and consumers to try and push our electorate to be one of the first true net zero emissions electorates in the country. And the results are really, really pleasing, with North Sydney having a higher rate of adoption of solar cells and a higher rate of electric vehicle adoption than other electorates across the country. So I think that says we're onto something good there. I also then took the quite unusual steps to lodge additional comments when it came to the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights report into anti-Semitism in Australian universities, because while in principle I agreed with the report, I believe that some of the recommendations in it went way further than the evidence that we received at the time. So again, I want to particularly thank Audrey, my Chief of Staff here, for working double time with the Secretariat to get those additional comments tabled. I think they added a really important element to the findings of that inquiry. In terms of events, I think we hosted a really important sort of landmark event in the youth mental health space, where we brought a new coalition called the Wellbeing and Prevention Coalition into the House. We managed to get the Health Minister, Minister Butler, to come and hear them out so that they could talk to him directly about what they believed as a coalition the federal government needed to be prioritising as we move forward in the area of youth mental health. And I can't underestimate actually how important that development is. You know, one of the things, as many of you would know, I've been a long-term participant in youth mental health advocacy in this country. And one of the things that has consistently struck me is the fragmentation of the voice, because there are so many organisations and bodies in this space who are all clambering for their own funding and their own kind of priority issue. I think it's really pleasing to see at the last 3 years that by working with that group, we've been able to encourage them to convalesce around a common goal. So they've brought themselves together as part of this Wellbeing and Prevention Coalition, which is growing exponentially. Other organisations are coming in, and they're coming back now with a singular voice to government. So I think that's actually a real legacy that North Sydney will leave with this Parliament as we move forward. We also obviously participated in the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights, the public hearing on anti-Semitism into Australian universities. We went to the National Press Club of Australia and supported Zoe Daniel as she stood up and spoke about the future of the independent politics in Australia. And if you haven't seen that Press Club address, I'd really encourage you to, because I think it was a fantastic presentation to our nation, and there's been lots of really positive feedback about it. We had a Team Tink post valedictory gathering, which was really lovely. And then later in that same week, we had a crossbench meeting with the Prime Minister at the Lodge and an independent crossbench dinner, which was all a really lovely way. If that is our last week in Parliament, I think it will be a lovely way to have gone out. At the same time, staff from the team attended everything from an ANU string quartet performance through to the UN Women Australia's annual parliamentary breakfast for International Women's Day. There was SBS Lunar New Year celebrations. There was Parliamentary Friends of Sydney Swans, and there was even a barbecue at the big house that our team managed to scramble to, which was great. In terms of meetings, we had a whole range of meetings, whether that was with specific ministers or advocacy groups. For me, a personal highlight was a private meeting with the Prime Minister. I took the opportunity to catch up with him on the basis that I am leaving Parliament, and to kind of share some of my observations with him around how I felt the Parliament had operated and things that I felt ambitions that the government could potentially pursue. So I really appreciated that opportunity to work with him on that. But I think it also just goes to show the level of respect that our seat has enjoyed in this last parliamentary term. I then, on a broader basis, hosted a crossbench briefing with the Clean Energy Investor Group, where we brought a whole heap of organisations that are working in this space into Parliament House and had a bit of a come to Jesus moment, speaking to them on the basis that how do we really ensure that no matter which major party ends up in government, we have an ongoing and consistent social mandate for our government to move us forward to a cleaner, greener future. And I think that that round table was a really good discussion. There were briefings on the scams legislation. We had our usual House and Senate crossbench meeting, which I chaired. We had the government crossbench legislative briefing that saw, you know, one-on-one conversations with everyone from the Assistant Treasurer to the Minister for Education, the Social Services Minister, a whole range of the Attorney General, talking to them about their legislative agendas. I took the opportunity to have a number of kind of exit interviews, so meeting with people like the Sergeant at Arms and the Parliamentary Workplace Services to provide them with feedback on what it's been like to be an independent in this workplace that's not built for us. And hopefully some of those observations will be taken on board to make it easier for the next generation of independents that come in with the 48th Parliament. One of the big cases I prosecuted, or prosecuted consistently during this term, but particularly in this last month, was the fact that the government's failed to deliver on its legislative promise to ban genetic discrimination in life insurance. We were able to secure, again, a private meeting with Stephen Jones, the Assistant Treasurer. David Pocock came with me, as did Zoe Daniel. And we just sort of sat down with him and members of the Treasury Department to reiterate that every day they delay delivery on this promise is actually affecting Australians' lives. This is not a nice to do. We absolutely need to move the laws to ensure that insurance companies can't use people's results from their genetic screening. We know at the moment there are Australians that would benefit from having genetic screening, but they're choosing not to because they fear that their life insurances would be cancelled or would be denied to them. And that's not okay, particularly given the Assistant Minister had taken the headline glory of committing to that reform back in September last year. So, 6 months on, nothing has actually been delivered to the Australian population. And I think that's pretty low, to be honest. We also had a fantastic briefing with the Treasurer looking at all of the key economic indicators when it comes to how our country is moving. And to be honest, I know not a lot of people are going to want to hear this, but we are actually in a better position than a number of other nations when it comes to the trends in our employment lines, the trends in our inflation lines, and even when you look at things like small business creation and failure, we know from the Small Business Ombudsman that about 25,000 small businesses failed in the last 12 months, but interestingly, up to 25,000 are being established in Australia at the moment every month. So there are metrics there that I think sometimes just do not get the headlines in newspapers like The Australian. So it's important that we continue to look at our economic data really authentically when we're digging under them. And one of the meetings I love, we actually caught up with Power Housing Australia to continue to advocate for all the work that we have done in the 47th Parliament about better access to social and affordable housing right across our country. And I think it's been I'm really grateful to have had the opportunity to speak to a number of organisations almost on my way out to provide them with the insight of what I've learned about this crazy environment that we call Parliament in Australia. At the same time, the staff and the team again scrambled to make sure they covered meetings with the Grattan Institute. We met with them to understand what, some election priorities could look like going into the next election. They were briefed on the USA's suspension of aid. They met with the Isolated Children's Parents Association of Australia. There was a Closing the Gap briefing with Senator McCarthy, an integrity roundtable with the Australian Institute and Think Forward. Thomas Mayo came to Canberra to brief people on what happens next, and particularly on strategic fleet and maritime labour. They met with Renew Australia on energy bills and energy bill savings plans, and also with the Royal Australian College of General Practice on election priorities. I know two of the things that they found particularly interesting was one with the National Disability Insurance Administrators. They have a drop-in session, so our team went along and presented a couple of cases, and actually one particular case which has been particularly upsetting for the team here, we were able to elevate to the Minister's personal attention with a handwritten note from me to her asking her to please intervene, and within 24 hours the person living here in our electorate had received a call from NDIA saying that there was finally progress on what he needed, which was a prosthetic for a limb that had been amputated. We also had a really interesting meeting with Quakers Australia on defence spending and transparency in defence spending, and that meeting has actually prompted this week. I've sent a letter to the Attorney General nationally, and I want to thank Connor for prepping it, where we actually are calling on the Attorney General to implement an auditing process on Australia's involvement in the arms industry. What are we exporting? Who are we exporting it to? And what are they using it for when we export it to them? There was a lot of media in the last few weeks as well, which is kind of interesting when I do feel like North Sydney is imminently being abolished. There was a lot of media coinciding with my valedictory speech. So whether that was ABC Radio or ABC News Breakfast, there was SBS World News came and did an interview, and then there was some Sky News agenda stuff. I also continued to back in my crossbench colleagues. So whether it was Allegra Spender's launch, she launched a private members bill calling for greater transparency around infrastructure spending, how it's allocated and whether it is successfully delivered. and also joined crossbench members when we were talking about the abhorrent electoral reform that we saw passed in that sitting week. Interestingly, I've also was approached to be involved with the filming of a documentary on mental health, particularly youth mental health globally. So I sat down with the producer of that and the interviewer with that, Shannon Harvey, to look at what's happening internationally. And really excitingly for me, I mean, outside the parliamentary sitting fortnight, but actually last week, the Guardian approached me and asked me to write an op-ed about what we'd seen the coalition's actions in relation to the advice that had been issued by the Climate Change Authority. So interestingly, the Guardian seemed to be keen for me to continue to write some op-eds for them as we move through the election process and out the other side. So that could be a bit of fun for me into the future. With the Parliament kind of process rapidly coming to an end, I must say there is still the chance of one final sitting week in this parliamentary term. There is a parliamentary sitting week currently planned for March the 25th. It's only a 3-day sitting week. If it happens, it will be about the government bringing out an interim budget so that people can get a sense of where they would see their spending priorities. And I would have said a week ago that there was no way we were going to get to that sitting week. But with the cyclone now bearing down on the coast up in Queensland and New South Wales, part of me wonders whether the government may actually delay any election call to make sure that as a nation we're able to support those communities if there is widespread destruction as a result of that. But on the basis that Parliament may have ended, I thought you might actually be interested in just a really brief summary on how we've shown up in terms of a parliamentary voice in the last 3 years. So on your behalf, I've attended 90% of all divisions that were called in the 47th Parliament, and that's a really high attendance rate compared to other people. And when I looked at the 10% I didn't attend, because actually being a high achiever, I was pretty sad I wasn't at 100%. The ones that I didn't go to were the votes where I had looked at them and thought this is nothing more than political mischief or political grandstanding. There was nothing of any substantive nature in the vote. So I chose to withhold our vote on that in form of protest, to be honest, because I felt like I didn't want to give it the weight of our vote to say that it warranted our time. Of the motions that went to division then, so I'm just reminding everyone a division is a vote, I supported government motions 49% of the time. I supported coalition motions 55% of the time, and I supported Greens motions 61% of the time. So the government motions I supported related to the incredible HECS reform that I think has fundamentally been driven by the crossbench and I think should be a crossbench legacy from this 47th Parliament. The fuel efficiency standards, which again, I think is an amazing crossbench legacy. As you guys know, governments have tried to bring that reform in for over a decade and a half. The only thing that was different in this 47th Parliament was an expanded crossbench. And I also supported the government and all the motions they moved around moving us to a net zero economy. When it comes to the opposition, I supported them in motions on small business. I supported them in some of the motions on the industrial relations reform, particularly as it related to small business. And I also supported them on the superannuation policy reform. You won't be surprised to know that the Greens motions that I supported were almost entirely in the climate change and environmental matters space. And I think at the moment, that's the piece that the coalition is trying to weaponise against myself and other independents, saying that our support of those motions show that we are Greens in disguise. Importantly, I backed my crossbench colleagues 100% of the time when it came to their calls for greater integrity and accountability, improved women's safety, greater investment and response to climate change mitigation and adaptation, and improved environmental laws. And I sleep very confidently at night knowing that if anybody ever bothers to go back through the Hansard of the 47th Parliament, they will see consistent voices from the crossbench calling for our country to have more ambition and to go further in terms of embracing a cleaner, greener future for our children and their children. In addition to that work, in the term of the Parliament, I've tabled 3 private members' bills in our electorate's name. The first to ensure cleaner, greener transport for all, and arguably that was a precursor to the government's own vehicle efficiency standards. The second, to end indefinite detention in Australia and make it illegal for our government to detain children. And in all honesty, this is probably the one piece that I leave Parliament a little bit brokenhearted, in that we haven't seen what I think should have been a significant improvement in the way we treat those seeking asylum in our country. And the third private member bill was really about introducing housing as a fundamental human right in Australia, and to put consumers at the forefront of policy development in this space. I wouldn't be surprised if particularly that third bill around housing for a human right doesn't come back in the next Parliament, because I feel like that has the same sort of legs that the crossbench work around the National Anti-Corruption Commission had over previous parliaments. And I also really hope there will continue to be a push on how we treat people seeking asylum from the crossbench as we move into the next government. As you guys know, I also served on a number of parliamentary committees, the first one being the Joint Select Committee, which was responsible for developing and gaining endorsement of the first ever binding code of conduct for parliamentarians and parliamentary workplaces in Australia. Pretty amazing outcome, and almost obscene to think it took us 122 years to get there, but we got there. And we did play a really significant role in that. I also sat, as you know, on the Parliamentary Joint Committee of Human Rights, who not only scrutinises every piece of legislation to ensure its human rights compatibility, but also undertook inquiries into a National Human Rights Act, into income management in Australia, and into anti-Semitism in universities across Australia. And I sat on the Joint Committee for the Parliamentary Library, which is a major source of fact-checking in the Parliament, and I think ensuring that it is well-resourced was one of the key kind of contributions, I think, from the crossbench. I established and launched the Parliamentary Friendships Group into youth mental health, whilst also co-chairing the groups for the Australian Red Cross, Amnesty International, Women in Work, and the Hazara community. And all in all, I moved 82 amendments to 19 different pieces of legislation seeking to improve accountability and transparency and ambition in public policy from our government. So all in all, I would have to say North Sydney's voice was heard in a way that it had not been heard for quite some time. And I was very proud to be the person standing up and delivering it time and time again. While I'm in Canberra, though, closer to home, things absolutely continue to tick over. So, and actually they continue to tick over for the next 4 weeks. So we had our Getting Off Gas event in Crow's Nest the week before last, and it was really fantastic to see so many curious people show up there to look at what it would mean to actually transition their kitchens in particular to fully electric mode. I want to particularly thank Asian Australians for Climate and Winnings for partnering with us on that, because I think it made all the difference to actually be able to see the devices in action cooking for us. This Sunday, so literally in not many sleeps time, we have our third and final deliberative democracy event, this time looking at ways that the federal government can provide greater support for small businesses. And interestingly, we've got a full turnout, including the Small Business Ombudsman will actually be sending a video message to that event. Some people have asked why I'm still pursuing that, given that we are so close to the end of this Parliament, and our response has been that our opinions still matter. So the North Sydney seat may not exist going forward, but the people who live here do. And while they will be absorbed into Warringah and Bradfield and Bennelong, it's a really important opportunity for us to create space for people from different backgrounds to come together and share their observations on how our government could be better supporting our small business. So we fully expect that event will go ahead on Sunday. What we're unsure of is the form of the report, because if the Prime Minister does happen to call the election this Sunday, if he happens to make the trip to the Governor-General's house, then I imagine our report will become more succinct, and it will probably just be an online kind of landing page so people at least get that feedback process. But if we get a little bit more time, then we will write a more thorough report and make sure that those findings are actually shared up the line with members of both major parties. Who knows, we might yet again inspire a policy direction, because we seem to have been able to do that when it came to housing, with the New South Wales government picking up our key recommendation from the housing report, and with early childhood education and care, with the federal government picking up some of the recommendations that our Deliberative Democracy Forum had come to in that space. Next Thursday, we have our final event in our Healthy Ageing series. This time we are partnering both with Willoughby City Council and Council of the Ageing, COTA, to host an event which is focused on learning more about isolation and loneliness by finding meaningful ways to connect with like-minded people and identifying easily accessible activities and groups. So I'm really looking forward to that. I take my hat off to the Healthy Ageing Working Group. I'm so grateful to them. I think they have brought an incredible series of events into our electorate in the course of the last 2 years. And this will be a lovely way for us to hand over this, what I'm hoping is a legacy to both COTA and Willoughby Council. I'm hoping they will continue to run these events because we've proven there is an appetite for them. And our final event as an electorate will be our International Women's Day breakfast this year. It will be our 4th year. We ran the first one when I was simply a little candidate, and we've maintained them throughout. This year I'll be co-hosting it with Zali Stegel. We will be holding it at the Ridges on McLaren Street in North Sydney. It's on the 19th of March. It's a much smaller venue this year because, as you would all know, the Kirribilli Club unfortunately has closed its doors. And so if you would like to be there on the morning of the 19th, I really encourage you to get in quick and grab a ticket or book a table. I'm sure it's going to be a morning to remember, and for me personally will be a really nice way, I suspect, to almost say goodbye to the electorate. In terms of wrapping up across the electorate, then there will actually be an electorate-wide newsletter. Will be dropped into everybody's mailbox. This little puppy coming to you live in the next week. It's really my way of saying thank you and farewell. There's also a nice little summary in the middle so people can see what together we've been able to achieve in the last 3 years. So as always, it has been an absolute privilege being your member for North Sydney. I think it is really made me as a person, and I'm grateful for the learnings that I've had, and I'm grateful for the friendships that we have built during this time. So if I can, in kind of a final closing piece, while I know everyone on this call is so committed to the process of community independence, I really would encourage you, if you are not yet, to get connected to one of the campaigns that are running in 2025. If you don't know where you are, please go to the AEC website. There is a link there to tell you where your new electorate will be. I know both Zali and Nicolette Buller are still desperately looking for volunteers, hands to help out with things. So please, if you have the capacity to get involved, because I know you guys were the making of me, for everything we did, and for everyone who talks about the role of Climate 200, the truth of the matter is our community did what we did in 2022, and I know that we can do it again. And I kind of feel it's actually very important to me personally to get Nicolette elected in Bradfield. So I know Zali still has a third of her electorate now that she needs to embrace and engage, but we do need to get Nicolette over the line. Excitingly, can I share with you, 1 in 5 electorates across Australia is running a community independent in 2025. That is huge. And I think it just says everything that needs to be said about the momentum behind this movement, and hopefully the direction that this movement will continue to take, not just in 2025, but 2028 and well beyond that. So thank you for being the creators of this moment in time. And with that all said, unless there are questions, I can see their comments. Thank you for all of your beautiful comments. I am going to sign out and let you out of school for our last ever parliamentary debrief. So much love to all of you. As I said, thank you for the opportunity, and I will no doubt see you all around on the hustings as we continue our march forward. So have a great night, everyone. Thank you.